Hi, welcome to Conflict Story, where we bring you the best and most fascinating stories just for you. Let's dive right into one of those stories. It begins like this.
The morning that dragged me into a courtroom drama began like any ordinary day. I was enjoying my coffee while scrolling through my phone when an unfamiliar number lit up my screen. The text read, "I know you have my car. I want it back now." I frowned, puzzled. The only car I owned was a cherished 1985 Mercedes 300 SL, a classic left to me by my late uncle. The car was more than transportation. It was a connection to countless childhood memories. Assuming the text was a mistake, I brushed it off. However, the next text shattered my assumption. "Don't ignore me, Thomas Bradley. That 300 SL is mine. Return it, or I'll call the police." Shocked, I reread the message. How did this person know my name? And why were they claiming my uncle's car? Deciding it must be a misunderstanding, I replied, "You have the wrong person. This car was legally inherited through my uncle's will. Please don't contact me again." I believe that was the end of it. Yet moments later, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a call. Against my better judgment, I picked up. "Hello?" A shrill voice greeted me, sharp enough to pierce through the receiver. "Listen here, you thief. That car is mine. Your uncle promised it to me years ago." My blood boiled. "Ma'am, I don't know who you are, but this car was left to me legally. Please stop harassing me." "Harassing you?" she shrieked. "I'm Deborah Collins, your uncle's neighbor for over 15 years. He always said the car would be mine. You must have tricked him into changing his will." I took a deep breath to steady my voice. "Miss Collins, that's not true. The car was rightfully inherited by me. I don't have time for this. Goodbye." I ended the call, blocked the number, and tried to calm my nerves. Whoever Deborah was, she had no claim to my uncle's car. I tried to focus on my day, but an unsettling thought lingered. What if this wasn't over? As I prepared to leave for my job as an architect at a downtown firm, my concerns materialized in the form of a woman standing in my driveway. She was in her mid-50s, her hair styled into a severe bob, and she wore a glaringly pink blazer that practically screamed for attention. Her eyes locked onto me with laser precision as she gestured at the Mercedes. "You!" she barked. "Give me the keys now!" I groaned inwardly. This had to be Deborah. "Miss Collins, I presume?" I said, feigning politeness. "I told you this car was left to me in my uncle's will. You're trespassing on my property. Leave now, or I'll involve the authorities." Her face reddened with fury. "You ungrateful brat. I took care of your uncle for years. He promised me that car. You have no right to it." Without another word, I unlocked the car and got in. "I'm leaving for work. If you're still here when I return, I'll call the police." Before I could close the door, she lunged and grabbed my arm. "You can't do this. I'll take you to court." "Go ahead," I snapped, yanking my arm free. "But touch me again, and I'll press charges for assault." Her furious glare followed me as I drove off, heart pounding. What was her endgame? And how far would she go to claim what wasn't hers? When I returned home that evening, I hoped the drama had ended. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw her, Deborah, sitting on my porch, arms crossed like a statue of indignation. My best friend Mark stood nearby, looking as baffled as I felt. Mark approached my car as I got out. "Dude, she's been here for hours. Want me to call the cops?" I sighed. "Not yet. Let me handle it." I turned to Deborah. "Miss Collins, this is your final warning. Leave my property or I'll have no choice but to involve the police." She stood, her chin jutting out defiantly. "I'm not leaving without what's rightfully mine. Your uncle wanted me to have that car. You're just some spoiled kid who doesn't appreciate it." Mark stepped in. "Lady, you can't just squat on someone's porch and demand their stuff. That's not how this works." Deborah's glare shifted to him. "Stay out of this, you millennial parasite." My patience snapped. "That's enough. The car is mine. I have the will to prove it. Leave or I'm calling the police." She huffed, muttering something about legal action, and finally stomped off. Mark shook his head. "What was that all about?" I explained the situation, and we spent the next hour trying to make sense of it. But the more we dissected it, the less sense it made. Just as Mark was leaving, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line made my stomach drop. Legal notice. Lawsuit filed. Collins versus Bradley. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The day after receiving the lawsuit notice, I woke up to an uneasy mix of anger and anxiety. Deborah Collins wasn't bluffing. She was determined to drag me into a legal battle over my uncle's car. I had no choice but to fight back. My first call was to my lawyer, Hannah Peterson, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney who'd helped me with some minor legal matters in the past. She picked up on the second ring. "Thomas, what's going on?" "You don't usually call this early," she said, her voice calm but curious. I explained the situation, walking her through Deborah's harassment, her claims, and now the lawsuit. Hannah listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she let out a low whistle. "This woman sounds like a piece of work," she said, "but if what you've told me is true and you have all the paperwork, this case shouldn't hold up. Can you bring me everything related to the will and the car transfer?" "Absolutely," I replied. "When can we meet?" "Come by my office this afternoon. The sooner we get ahead of this, the better." By 2 p.m., I was sitting in Hannah's office, a small but impeccably organized space lined with bookshelves full of legal texts. I handed her a folder containing my uncle's will, the car's title, and other relevant documents. Hannah scanned them, nodding occasionally. "This is all solid," she said after a few minutes. "Your uncle's will explicitly names you as the heir to his Mercedes. The title is in your name, and the transfer was completed legally. Deborah Collins doesn't have a leg to stand on unless she can produce hard evidence of some prior agreement, which I'm guessing she can't." "She's claiming he made a verbal promise to her," I said, frustration creeping into my voice. "How does that even work in court?" Hannah smirked. "It doesn't. Verbal agreements are notoriously hard to prove, especially when there's a written will that contradicts them. Still, we need to be prepared for whatever nonsense she tries to throw at us. Let's start by filing a motion to dismiss the case." Over the next few days, Hannah worked tirelessly on our response, drafting the motion and gathering evidence to support my claim. Meanwhile, Deborah escalated her antics. She took to social media, posting rants about how I'd stolen the car she deserved. She even managed to get a few of her friends to comment in support of her, though their posts were vague and clearly biased. I tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. Every notification on my phone felt like a punch to the gut, a reminder that this nightmare wasn't over. Mark, ever the supportive friend, suggested we take a break from the drama by going for a drive in the Mercedes. "Let's remind you why this car is worth fighting for," he said with a grin. We spent the afternoon cruising through the countryside, the Mercedes gliding effortlessly over winding roads. The drive brought back memories of my uncle, his laughter, and the stories he'd shared during our rides. By the time we got back, I felt a renewed sense of determination. This car wasn't just a vehicle, it was a piece of my family's history, and I wasn't going to let Deborah take it away. A week later, the court date for the motion to dismiss arrived. Walking into the courthouse, I was struck by how surreal it felt to be there over something so absurd. Hannah was by my side, calm and confident, while Deborah sat at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer, a slick-looking man in a cheap suit. The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, entered the courtroom and called the session to order. Hannah presented our case clearly and concisely, laying out the evidence and emphasizing the lack of any documentation supporting Deborah's claims. "Your Honor," Hannah concluded, "this lawsuit is frivolous and baseless. The defendant has provided ample proof of his rightful ownership of the vehicle in question. We respectfully request that the court dismiss this case immediately." Deborah's lawyer argued that the case should proceed, claiming they had witnesses who could corroborate her story. The judge listened patiently before speaking. "Gee-wee, while the plaintiff's claims are tenuous at best, I'm inclined to allow the case to proceed to trial in the interest of fairness. However, I warn the plaintiff that this court will not tolerate frivolous litigation. Both parties are expected to present substantial evidence at trial." My heart sank as the judge set a trial date for 3 weeks later. Deborah smirked at me as we left the courtroom, her confidence infuriating. Hannah placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, Thomas. We've got this. She has nothing to back her claims. Now we just need to prepare for trial." I nodded, trying to ignore the knot in my stomach. This fight was far from over. The 3 weeks leading up to the trial were some of the most stressful days of my life. Deborah Collins didn't just sit back and wait. She seemed determined to make my life as miserable as possible in the interim. It started with daily phone calls from unknown numbers. Most of the time, there was just silence on the other end. Other times, I'd hear muffled breathing or whispered insults. "You're going to lose," one voice hissed before hanging up. I reported everything to Hannah, who advised me to document every incident. Then came the flyers. One morning as I walked out to grab the mail, I saw my neighborhood plastered with bright yellow flyers. In bold letters they read, "Thomas Bradley, car thief. Ask him why he stole his uncle's car." Below that, Deborah had printed her version of events, painting herself as the victim of a heartless betrayal. My stomach churned as I read the lies. I could see my neighbors glancing at me curiously, some even whispering to each other. It felt like the walls were closing in. Hannah was livid when I showed her the flyer. "This is defamation," she said firmly. "We'll address it in court. For now, don't engage. Let me handle this." The turning point came when Mark, my ever-loyal friend, decided to do some digging of his own. "This woman doesn't just wake up one day and decide to sue someone over a car," he reasoned. "She must have a history." Mark's research uncovered 2 previous lawsuits filed by Deborah. In one case, she had claimed that a deceased friend promised her an expensive watch. In another, she alleged that a former employer had promised her a substantial bonus that never materialized. Both cases had been dismissed for lack of evidence. When I shared this information with Hannah, her eyes lit up. "This is exactly what we needed," she said. "It establishes a pattern of behavior. We'll use this to discredit her in court." As the trial date approached, I threw myself into gathering evidence. I dug through old photos, looking for any that showed me and my uncle with the car. I contacted his old friends and colleagues, hoping they might provide testimony about his intentions. Most of them remembered him speaking fondly of the car, but none had ever heard him mention Deborah. The day of the trial arrived faster than I expected. I woke up early, my stomach in knots. After a restless night, I forced myself to eat a small breakfast and dressed in the sharpest suit I owned. Hannah picked me up and drove us to the courthouse, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to my nerves. The courtroom was crowded, with a mix of curious onlookers and Deborah's so-called supporters. She was already there, wearing another eye-searingly bright outfit. Today it was a neon green blazer that practically glowed under the courtroom lights. Her smirk was firmly in place as she glanced at me. The judge entered and the room fell silent. After the formalities, Deborah's lawyer, a man named Alan Griggs, began his opening statement. He painted Deborah as a selfless neighbor who had dedicated years of her life to helping my uncle. According to him, her devotion had earned her the right to the car, regardless of what the will stated. When it was Hannah's turn, she wasted no time dismantling their narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "this case is about facts, not feelings. The facts show that my client, Thomas Bradley, legally inherited the car from his uncle. The plaintiff's claims are baseless, unsupported by evidence, and part of a troubling pattern of similar behavior." The trial proceeded with witness testimonies. Deborah called a former neighbor who claimed to have overheard my uncle talking about how much Deborah loved the car. Under cross-examination, Hannah quickly established that the neighbor had no direct knowledge of any promise. Deborah herself took the stand, spinning a tearful tale about her alleged friendship with my uncle and how he had promised her the car during one of their many conversations. She even produced a handwritten note she claimed was from him, though the handwriting looked suspiciously different from his usual scrawl. Hannah requested a handwriting analysis, which the judge approved. When it was our turn, Hannah presented the will, the title, and the documented history of the car's ownership. She also introduced the evidence of Deborah's previous lawsuits, framing them as part of a pattern of opportunistic behavior. Finally, she called Mark to the stand to testify about the flyers and harassment I'd endured. The highlight of the trial came when the handwriting analysis confirmed what we already suspected. The note Deborah had presented was a forgery. The judge's expression turned icy as she addressed Deborah. "Miss Collins, this court does not look kindly on attempts to deceive and manipulate the legal process. Your actions have wasted this court's time and caused undue stress to the defendant." By the time closing arguments were made, it was clear that Deborah's case was crumbling. Hannah delivered a powerful summary, emphasizing the lack of evidence and the clear intent to defraud. Deborah's lawyer looked visibly defeated as he made his final remarks. When the judge finally announced her decision, I held my breath. This court finds in favor of the defendant, Thomas Bradley. The plaintiff's claims are entirely without merit. Furthermore, the plaintiff is ordered to pay the defendant's legal fees and a fine for submitting fraudulent evidence. Relief washed over me as the courtroom erupted in murmurs. Deborah looked stunned, her neon green blazer seeming to dull as she slumped in her seat. Hannah turned to me with a triumphant smile. "It's over, Thomas. You won." As I left the courthouse, surrounded by friends and family who had come to support me, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. My uncle's car was safe, and justice had been served. Driving home in the Mercedes that evening, I couldn't help but smile. This wasn't just a victory for me, it was a victory for my uncle's memory and the bond we shared. The weeks following the trial felt like stepping back into the light after being buried under a mountain of stress. Deborah Collins' antics had finally caught up with her, and the courtroom's decision ensured she wouldn't bother me again. But while the case was over, the impact lingered. It started with my neighbors. Many who had once eyed me suspiciously began approaching me with sheepish smiles and apologetic words. "We had no idea she was lying," one of them said. "She's always been intense, but we didn't think she'd go this far." Mark, of course, couldn't resist teasing me about my newfound local celebrity status. "You're practically famous now," he joked one evening over beers. "The guy who stood up to the neighborhood Karen and won?" Despite the levity, I couldn't fully relax. Deborah's flyers had left a mark, and though her credibility was in tatters, I still felt the occasional sting of judgmental glances. Hannah had reassured me that we could pursue further legal action if Deborah violated the court's injunction, but so far she'd kept her distance. One rainy afternoon, I found myself in the garage tinkering with the Mercedes. It had always been more than a car to me, a symbol of my bond with my uncle, and a reminder of his love for classic craftsmanship. As I polished the hood, I thought back to the countless hours we'd spent restoring it together. This car wasn't just an inheritance, it was a legacy. My reverie was interrupted by a knock at the door. Wiping my hands on a rag, I opened it to find an unfamiliar man in a suit standing on the porch. "Mr. Bradley?" he asked, extending a business card. "I'm Anthony Reed, a journalist with the Tribune. I'd like to interview you about your recent court case." I hesitated, glancing at the card. The last thing I wanted was to relive the drama, but part of me knew that sharing my side of the story could help clear the air once and for all. Over the next hour, I recounted the ordeal, emphasizing the importance of standing up for what's right. Anthony listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "Your story's compelling," he said when I finished. "It's not just about the car. It's about honoring family and fighting against entitlement. I think a lot of people will relate to that." When the article was published a week later, the response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from friends, colleagues, and even strangers. Many shared their own experiences with people like Deborah, thanking me for standing my ground. It was cathartic, a final nail in the coffin of her false narrative. As life slowly returned to normal, I made a promise to myself. The Mercedes would be more than just a keepsake. It would be a way to honor my uncle's memory by doing what he loved most: driving, exploring, and sharing stories along the way. One weekend, Mark and I took the car on a road trip to the coast, the salty breeze and open road reminding me of why my uncle had cherished it so deeply. Deborah, meanwhile, faded into the background. Rumor had it she was trying to sell her house, though I couldn't say for certain. Part of me felt a twinge of pity for her. She'd spent so much time chasing what wasn't hers that she'd lost sight of what truly mattered. But whatever sympathy I had was tempered by the memory of her lies and harassment. One sunny morning, as I slid behind the wheel of the Mercedes, I glanced at the passenger seat and imagined my uncle sitting there, grinning as he always did. "We did it," I said softly. "We kept it safe." Starting the engine, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The fight was over, the car was mine, and life was finally moving forward. Are you hungry for more slices of stories? Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell to never miss out on any videos. See you tomorrow.